Hi, my name is Mike McGriff. I'm the founding editor of Tavern Books, and we are a nonprofit literary press based in Portland, Oregon, founded in 2009. And we print poetry books, books and translations, and books that have gone out of print. And our newest book is William Stafford's book, Winterward, which is not a book at all. It is the 1954 creative dissertation that he wrote at the University of Iowa. And I've written an essay about this book, and I'm going to read it to you. I wrote this for the Friends of William Stafford newsletter. And I will say this with sincerity and respect, but I am baffled at the cult of William Stafford. And I took that as the idea for this essay. I'm an Oregonian. I'm from Coos Bay. I write about salmon and trees and things. And William Stafford is a kindred spirit. Ask Me is one of my favorite poems, but the cult of William Stafford I find to be very interesting. So I wanted to write an essay that sort of maybe held up that as a bit of a lens. So this is the essay about Winterward that I wrote for the Friends of William Stafford newsletter. The publication of Winterward, which we published this year, marks many things. First and foremost, it marks the emergence of a totally new, as well as a completely unique, single-volume collection by one of post-war America's most beloved and critically acclaimed poets. For this reason alone, poetry lovers of all stripes have cause for celebration. But first, a bit of backstory and a few musings. Paul Merchant, former William Stafford archivist at Lewis and Clark College and a fine poet and translator, has been at the forefront of researching, unearthing, contextualizing, preserving, and disseminating the wonders of William Stafford's legacy. The term archivist falls far short in describing Paul's vocation at the Stafford Archive. I would like to suggest an overhaul for the definition of the term archivist. For Paul's sake, let's say archivist is now a combination of two words, archive and activist. That's a far better way of framing what Paul's been up to over the decades. It should be of little surprise then that it was Paul who brought Winterward to the attention of Tavern Books nearly 3 years ago. I was visiting the William Stafford archive while Carl Adamczyk, it's together with Carl Adamczyk and Natalie Garriott that I edit Tavern Books, was one of its writers in residence. Paul had offered to give me a tour and show me some of the archive's gems and oddities, its rarities and B-sides. Being both a bibliophile and a fan of Stafford's work, I was absolutely thrilled. At this point, Carl and I had already started Tavern Books, with the simple and explicit vision to reintroduce lost works of poetry to the reading public. Books that had fallen out of print, books by neglected masters, books in translations, books so obscure that obscure was somehow a generous moniker. Paul's tour was insightful and totally exhilarating, but that's not where this detective story begins. Poetry is a curious and thankless genre. Writing poetry, spreading the word about great collections, publishing poetry, discovering a new author, these are all acts and byproducts of community and the grassiest of grassroots efforts. As genres, nonfiction and fiction have a boundless community generated by the marketplace, for good or ill, whereas poetry depends on free public readings, universities, get-togethers in living rooms, telephone calls between friends, newsletters, and writing groups to keep the sparks floating through the air. Which brings me back to Paul Merchant. We were sitting in the archive when Paul showed us a facsimile copy of Winterward, the creative portion of Stafford's 1954 PhD dissertation as submitted to the University of Iowa. For a lover of rare and obscure manuscripts, I'm a bibliophile, this was an object of art. Even in its facsimile edition, it was completely glorious. It's easy to forget that our literary heroes and ancestors are, what's the right word, human, real. We have a burning and unhealthy desire to ignore this very fact. We love cults. We want Ted Hughes to play the role of the mustachioed villain in his dark cape of lust. We want Carl Sandburg cradling a sheep with a bit of fog drifting through the background on its little tiny cat feet. It's essential for us, for poetry, and for the legacy of the poet, the man, the individual himself, to keep William Stafford framed within the human, earthly, fragile, temporary, fallible, talented, and untalented. And that's exactly what happened when Carl and I saw that bound stack of photocopied dissertation pages. He was the first evidence of and movement toward a major poet's first collection. Stafford, the graduate student. William with no published poetry book, Stafford. You and me. Anyone who's ever sat down to seriously write a poem. The myth stripped away. Another person bent over a formidable blank page, suddenly whisked into the sublime by lyrical poetry and all its myriad traditions. Winterward is a stack of 8.5 by 11 photocopied pages, shown with a kind of refreshing anonymity. And so the detective story begins. What is Winterward exactly? Is it a book? Is it merely a dissertation? Is it both? Is it neither? Is it something altogether different? First off, it's a reminder of just how many essential American literary voices have passed through the halls of the University of Iowa and the Writers' Workshop. The University of Iowa began accepting creative dissertations and partial fulfillment of advanced degrees in the early 1920s, a move that gave birth to the MFA program, as well as to the fostering and funding of creative writing within English departments across the country. By the time Stafford submitted Winterward as part of his advanced degree, the Writers' Workshop had been in official existence for nearly 20 years, a staggering fact. He was born in 1914. Winterward is a reminder, and it's also a snapshot of an emerging writer purposefully sculpting a collection of poems, a point that Paul highlights in his 6-page bibliographic note in the Tavern Books edition of Winterward. This is from Paul Merchant. Of the 35 poems in Winterward, 18 were composed during the 2 years spent in the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop between the fall of 1950 and the summer of 1952. 7 were written in Oregon between leaving the workshop and submission of the dissertation in February 1954. The remaining 10 were already in Stafford's files when he arrived at Iowa. The willingness to exclude successful poems from and before the workshop suggests that Stafford was deliberately fashioning a coordinated collection, rather than simply assembling a gathering of his best poems. The result is a tough, somber book, Merchant writes, created during years of uncertainty and privation. We're not often given access to a poet's creative laboratory. What's of interest here, to me, is what's not included in Winterward. By the time Stafford showed up at the gates of Iowa, he'd already written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of poems. He'd already gained notoriety through high-profile publications and venues such as The New Yorker, and none of the poems from The New Yorker, it turns out, end up in Winterward. Importantly, Winterward shows us a poet in pursuit of crafting a slim, carefully condensed, cohesive volume of poetry. And what's more striking is that, though crafted as a book, Winterward ultimately dissatisfied Stafford as a publishable volume. Again, more patience. No lowering of standards. Only 7 poems from Winterward would find their way into Stafford's first full-length collection, West of Your City, published in 1960. A reminder, a snapshot, but also a blueprint. In addition to West of Your City, Winterward contains poems that later appeared in several notable collections, including The Rescued Year and Traveling Through the Dark, as well as several chapbooks. It's disarming, even shocking, to open Winterward and find such famous poems as Bifocal and The Fish Counter at Bonneville in the table of contents. Perhaps a blueprint is what Winterward most resembles, the plans drawn up by a great and instinctive draftsman, plans that were eventually scrapped so a new plan could take shape, so a new instinct could be followed like the golden thread. Looking at Winterward through this lens reminds us of the acute patience and care that go into the crafting of both a single poem and a book of poetry. All the dead ends and missteps and bad writing and horrible writing and good writing and happy accidents it takes just to get one line to take shape on the page. We're especially proud of this publication. Importantly and significantly, the publication of Winterward was a community project. We worked closely with Paul Merchant, Jeremy Skinner, who selected all of the photos that we used in the book, which includes Stafford student ID, which shows up as the end sheets, and Doug Erickson at Lewis and Clark College Special Collections. The book started in the William Stafford Archive as a pile of manuscript pages and an idea, and has returned there as a trade edition in cloth and paper-bound forms. Paul Merchant and Kim Stafford helped us formulate the architecture of the book itself, cover art, fonts, layout, front and back matter. Winterward took many iterations with Paul and Kim Stafford serving as sounding boards, spin doctors, and veto holders. Paul Merchant, Kim Stafford, and Vince Wixon poured over this book, lending us their editorial time and expertise. We received generous grants from both the Friends of William Stafford and the Oregon Cultural Trust and the National Endowment for the Arts, which, along with donations from numerous individual donors, allowed us to double our print run and issue the book in hardcover. It's humbling to be surrounded by a community and institutions that come together to support a unique publication of an important regional and national author. We're a national press with our ear to the rail, and we're a regional press with a national scope. No matter how one prefers to frame William Stafford and his work, Winterward fits perfectly into our unconventional and forward-thinking catalog and ethos. One of the most striking parts of this collection is how it opens with William Stafford speaking to us from his 1954 preface. The preface, which Stafford wrote and then ultimately removed from his dissertation, heretofore only existed in the Lewis and Clark Special Collections. Simply put, Stafford's prose is astounding. The poet references Wordsworth, Milton, Cocteau, and Pound in an effort to frame the strengths and shortcomings of his own work, as well as the strengths and shortcomings of the workshop culture in general. Stafford articulates the precarious position of the writer. He sees himself giving in to contemporary trends and artistic institutionalization, while at the same time reaching toward the repose of mind and religiousness of purpose that one finds when following one's own artistic impulses, one's artistic impulses and artistic aesthetic impulses. As a poet, Stafford clearly sees himself wearing the Janus mask. Before us on the page is a writer, thinker, and a citizen fully embroiled in a tangle of contradictions. From the get-go, we see a great and complicated mind at work. We're delighted with his collection, even if it isn't exactly a book. Poor William Stafford, have we lowered his standards against his will by publishing this collection? I'm confident that we have not. In fact, I believe the opposite is true. I'm delighted those new to Stafford's work, longtime admirers and scholars alike, will find something to cherish in these pages. This dissertation was completed nearly 60 years ago, yet it's only through its publication in 2013 that we're offered this fresh view into a thrilling body of work from a major writer. Kim Stafford wrote to us, quote, "Once you open Winterward, it's like a literary detective story," quote. This sentiment speaks to the mystery and impulse of any poet, of any collection of poems. With the publication of Winterward, we are now given the opportunity to take part in another chapter of such a mystery. And now I will read two poems which heretofore have not existed in this book, and now they do. Both very famous poems. The Fish Counter at Bonneville. Downstream, they have killed the river, built a dam. By that power they wire to hear a light. A turbine strides high poles to spit this flame. At this flume going down, a spot glows white where an old man looks at the ghosts of the game. Flickering twilight deep, dumb shapes that glide. So many Chinook souls, so many silver-side. And the often quoted bifocal. Sometimes, up out of this land, a legend begins to move. It is a coming near of something under. Is it a coming near of something under love? Love is of the earth only, the surface, a map of roads leading wherever go miles of little bushes nod. Not so the legend under, fixed, inexorable, deep as the darkest mine, the thick rocks won't tell. His fire burns the leaf, and out of the green appears the vein in the center line, and the legend veins under there. So the world happens twice. Once, what we see, it is. Second, it legends itself, deep the way it is. And for those of you who know Stafford's work, this is a completely different version of the poem.